Imagine for a moment that you are living 150 years ago, far out on the open American frontier. The nearest doctor is a hard 2-day ride away, if there even is a doctor to be found at all. There is no pharmacy anywhere. There are no bottles of medicine sitting on any shelf. And yet, when sickness came creeping into the cabin, as it always surely did, the settler family was very far from helpless. They turned, exactly as their parents and their grandparents had turned before them, to the plants growing right there, outside their own door. These families held a deep and practical knowledge of the plants all around them, what each one was good for in the old traditions, when to gather it, and how their ancestors had used it for many long generations. It was a knowledge born purely of necessity, tested and proven over an entire lifetime of hard experience, and passed down carefully from one generation to the next like a precious treasure. And then, in just a few short generations, almost all of it quietly slipped away from us and was very nearly forgotten. In the next half hour, I am going to walk you carefully through 7 of the plants that the settlers grew, gathered, and turned to instead of going to the doctor. What each one truly meant to them, how exactly they used it in their own time, and the old reasons that they trusted these plants so very completely. And number 5 is a plant that you very likely have sitting in your spice rack or growing in your garden at this very moment. One that the settlers reached for again and again. Now, I want to be completely honest and completely clear with you right from the very start, because this matters more than anything else. Everything in this video is history and tradition. It is the story of how our ancestors understood and used these plants in their own time, and nothing more than that. It is absolutely not medical advice, and nothing here is any kind of recommendation for you to treat any condition yourself. Plants can be genuinely powerful, some of them are truly dangerous, and many have toxic lookalikes that can fool even careful people. So please, always speak with a qualified doctor for any health concern you may have, and never use any plant as a remedy without proper professional guidance. This is a history lesson, told with respect and with care, nothing more and nothing less. With all of that very firmly understood between us, let us now step back in time together into a world where the family garden and the family medicine chest were very nearly one and the same thing. Welcome to the American settler garden, the place where we dig up the forgotten plant wisdom of America's pioneers. The families who, out of sheer and pressing necessity, became keen observers and faithful keepers of the old healing traditions of the land. To truly understand why these plants mattered so enormously to them, you first have to picture clearly the world that the settlers actually lived in. Real trained doctors were very few, often very far away, and almost always very expensive to call upon. Hospitals, as we understand them today, simply did not exist at all for most rural frontier families. So when a small child took a sudden fever in the dead of night, or when a man cut himself badly while splitting the winter firewood, or when the whole family came down at once with the deep coughs and chills of a hard winter, there was very often simply no one at all to call upon for help. There was only what the family already knew in their hearts and their memories, and what happened to be growing nearby. And so the settler home quite naturally became its own quiet little apothecary. Bunches of carefully dried herbs hung down from the rafters overhead. Jars of salves, oils, and tinctures, every one of them made patiently by hand, sat in neat rows upon the shelves. The woman of the house was very often the family's healer, carrying in her own memory the traditional uses of dozens upon dozens of different plants, knowledge that she herself had learned years before at her own mother's sides. This was not magic, and it most certainly was not foolishness. It was the practical, hard-won folk medicine of people who simply had no other choice in the matter, refined and tested over a great many generations of patient, careful observation. A great deal of this rich tradition had come over from the old country with the settlers, and a great deal more of it was learned with real gratitude from the native peoples whose own healing traditions stretched back countless centuries upon this very land. Together, all of it formed a deep and rich body of folk knowledge. And like so very much of the old settler wisdom, it very nearly vanished from the earth entirely when we finally traded the cabin for the city and the family herb garden for the corner pharmacy. But today, let us pause and remember it, beginning with the very first plant. Number 1. Elderberry. The elder is a tall, graceful shrub that produces broad, flat clusters of tiny, creamy white flowers all through the spring, which then give way to heavy, drooping bunches of small, dark purple berries by the time late summer arrives. Few plants of any kind were more deeply cherished in the entire settler tradition of home care than the generous elder. It was very often fondly called the medicine chest of the country people, precisely because so very many different parts of it were carefully put to good use. In the old traditions, the dark ripe berries were gathered carefully in the fall and cooked slowly down into rich syrups, cordials, and preserves. And these precious preparations were then treasured especially all through the long, cold winter months ahead. The fragrant white spring flowers, in their turn, were dried and gently steeped into soft teas. Settler families turned to their various elderberry preparations, particularly in the hard season of winter coughs, colds, and chills, holding faithfully to a deep and abiding traditional belief in the comfort and the support that the plant offered to the body during that most difficult season of the year. It is genuinely interesting and telling to note that the elder has held this very same trusted reputation across a great many different cultures and across a great many long centuries all around the entire world. When you find a single plant valued so very consistently by so many wholly different peoples across so very much time and distance, it tells you something important about just how central it truly was to the way that our ancestors cared for their families and their own. To the settlers, having a good, healthy elder bush growing near the home was something very close indeed to a plain necessity of life. And here I must pause for a genuinely important and serious word of caution, one that the settlers themselves understood and deeply respected. The raw, uncooked berries of the elder, along with its leaves, its stems, and its roots, all contain natural substances that can make a person really quite ill indeed, which is the very reason that the berries were always thoroughly cooked before they were ever used. There are also genuinely dangerous look-alike plants out there that can easily fool the unwary. This is a perfect example of exactly why all of this knowledge must always be treated as history first, and why these plants should truly never be used without genuine, proper expertise. To the settlers, the elder was a treasured old friend, but it was a friend that they always handled with real knowledge and real care. The next plant on our list was perhaps the single most common everyday comfort in the whole of the settler home. Number 2. Peppermint. Peppermint, with its wonderfully bright, sharp, clean, and cooling scent, was without doubt one of the most common and best-loved herbs in the entire settler garden, and very likely the one that was reached for the most often of all for the small everyday comforts of life. Very nearly every single homestead grew at least a patch of it, and dried bundles of fragrant mint were a permanent fixture hanging in the kitchen. The great everyday use of the peppermint was, quite simply, a warm and soothing cup of mint tea. In the old and trusted tradition, this gentle, soothing tea was turned to after a heavy or rich meal, or whenever someone in the family had a stomach that felt uneasy, upset, or unsettled, in the long-held and deeply familiar belief that the mint helped to calm and to settle the troubled digestion. A simple pot of warm mint tea was the settler family's gentle, familiar, ready answer to all the small, ordinary, Everyday discomforts of daily frontier life, the kind of little troubles that did not call for anything stronger or more serious at all. What truly made the peppermint so very beloved in the home was its sheer pleasantness and its great gentleness. It was not in any way a fearsome or a dangerously powerful plant to be handled with dread and caution. It was instead a thoroughly kind and friendly one, perfectly safe and always welcome in the everyday life of the family, deeply pleasing to the taste and wonderfully comforting in its warmth. Even the smallest children could happily drink it down, and it grew with absolutely no trouble or fuss at all, spreading itself eagerly all across the garden, always there and always ready whenever it happened to be wanted. And as always, I share this only as the tradition of how the settlers themselves once used and understood their mint, and never as health advice for you today. But of all the many plants in this video, the humble peppermint shows us perhaps the very gentlest and most deeply human side of the whole settler, apothecary. Sometimes, you see, what a tired, worn-out, hard-working family needed, most of all at the end of the day, was not a strong or serious medicine at all, but simply a warm, fragrant, comforting cup of something soothing to share together as the long day finally drew to its close. The next plant on our list was the bright golden flower of the entire healing garden. Number 3. Calendula. Calendula, which was very often fondly called pot marigold by the old families, is a wonderfully cheerful flower with bright, glowing, golden-orange blooms, and it held a true place of real honor within the settler's garden of useful and healing plants. While it most certainly did brighten the whole garden beautifully with its color, the settlers grew it carefully for so very much more than merely its lovely good looks. In the old traditions, it was the golden petals of the calendula that were the truly prized part of the plant, gathered carefully and dried, and then slowly infused into oils, or else patiently worked by hand into healing salves and soothing balms. These homemade calendula preparations were valued above all else for their use upon the skin. They were the settler family's traditional, trusted answer for minor scrapes, for chapped and cracked and weathered skin, and for all the small wounds and irritations that came with a hard-working outdoor life, held to in the steady old belief that the calendula helped to soothe and to comfort the troubled skin, and to support its own natural healing. This was exactly the kind of plant that a careful settler mother always kept close on hand, because out on a frontier homestead, small cuts, scrapes, blisters, splinters, and rough chapped skin were simply an unavoidable daily fact of life for everyone. A good jar of that golden calendula salve sitting ready on the shelf was a quiet sort of reassurance, a simple homemade comfort always ready and waiting for. Whenever the rough, demanding work of the long day took its small but steady toll upon the body. And once again, I do remind you, gently but also very firmly, that I am only describing history and old tradition here, the way that our own ancestors once understood and used this plant, and never any kind of advice for you to actually follow today. But the calendula reminds us beautifully of just how very much of all settler medicine was really, at its heart, about the simple, patient daily care of the body, the skin, and the small everyday hurts of an enormously physical and demanding life. The next plant on our list was a tall and striking spire of the old healing garden. And now we come to number 4, a tall, soft, silvery plant that you have very likely seen many times growing wild along the roadsides and in old, neglected fields without ever once knowing just how very much the settlers treasured it. Number 4. Mullein. Mullein is truly unmistakable once you have learned to know it. In its very first year of life, it forms a low rosette of large, soft, wonderfully fuzzy, silvery green leaves, and then in its second year, it sends up a tall, dramatic flowering spike entirely covered in small yellow flowers, sometimes reaching up even higher than a grown person stands. It grows wild and remarkably abundant across much of America, thriving happily in poor soil and in forgotten, neglected places, and so the settlers came to know it very well indeed. In the settler tradition, the mullein was associated above all else with the chest and with the breath. The large, soft, fuzzy leaves and the bright yellow flowers were carefully dried and then steeped into gentle teas, turned to particularly during the long season of winter coughs and chest complaints, held to in the long-established old folk belief that the mullein offered some comfort and support to the breath and to the chest. It was very much one of the plants that a family naturally turned to when the deep coughs of the cold months finally settled into the home. The dried leaves were also sometimes used in certain other traditional ways that were likewise tied to easing the breath. What is genuinely remarkable about the mullein is just how very widespread and how very consistent this same reputation was across so many places, across many different regions and many different groups of people, very much including the native traditions of this land. This same tall, soft, wild plant was tied again and again, over and over, to the chest and to the breathing. That kind of broad and independent agreement, arising among many separate peoples who never once spoke to one another, is part of exactly what made the settlers trust so deeply in the plants that they chose to use. The knowledge had already been carefully tested by a great many different hands over a very great deal of time. And I will say it once again here, gently, because it always truly matters. This is only the history of how the mullein was once understood and used in the old traditions, and it is most certainly not medical advice, nor any kind of suggestion at all for you to treat anything yourself. But the mullein, that soft silver giant of the open roadside, shows us so well how the resourceful settlers managed to find a whole entire apothecary even out in the wild, weedy, neglected, and forgotten corners of the land around them. The next plant on our list is one that you very likely have sitting within easy arm's reach right now. Number 5. Garlic. And here at last is the very one that I promised you, the plant that is very likely sitting in your own kitchen or growing out in your garden at this exact moment. To the settlers, garlic was treasured not only as a food, and not only as a plant of protection for the home, but also as one of the single most trusted plants in the whole long tradition of family home care. Garlic has been deeply valued by people for its supposed strengthening and protective qualities for many thousands of years, stretching all the way back into the most ancient of human civilizations, and the settlers very gladly inherited that same deep and abiding respect for it. In the old folk tradition, garlic was turned to, especially during the long cold and flu season of the deep winter, eaten freely and generously, and worked into all manner of different home preparations, held to in the long-established belief that it helped to strengthen the body and to support it against the many sicknesses of the cold and dark months. What truly made the garlic so very central to the settler home was that wonderful, rare combination of being food, flavor, and a trusted folk remedy all at one and the same time, while also being so very easy and so very reliable to grow and to store away through the whole long winter. A single braid of garlic hanging down in the cool cellar was, all at the very same time, a fine seasoning for the cooking pot, a faithful guardian of the stored winter food, and, in the family's own traditional belief, a quiet support for their health all through the dark and difficult season. Very few plants of any kind ever earned their honored place so very many times over. And as always, this is only the old tradition that I am sharing with you, the way that the settlers themselves once understood and trusted this plant, and never any medical advice of any kind for today. But the garlic is such a beautiful example of how, for the settlers, the line between the kitchen and the medicine chest very nearly disappeared completely. That very same humble plant that flavored the evening supper was, in their own eyes, also quietly helping to keep the whole beloved family strong and well. The next plant on our list carried one of the very most soothing reputations of them all. Number 6, chamomile. Chamomile is a low, delicate, finely-leaved herb with small, sweet, daisy-like white flowers that carry a wonderfully gentle, apple-like scent, and it was without doubt one of the most beloved soothing plants in the entire settler tradition of home care. If the peppermint was the great herb of the uneasy and unsettled stomach, then the chamomile was very often the cherished herb of rest, of calm, and of quiet peace at the close of the day. In the old tradition, the small flowers of the chamomile were carefully dried and then gently steeped into a soft, golden, fragrant tea, and this mild and pleasant chamomile tea was turned to in the quiet evenings, or else in times of restlessness, worry, and unease, held to in the long-established belief that it helped to gently calm the nerves and to ease a tired person softly and gradually toward sleep and rest. It was the settler family's mild and kindly comfort for a fretful, crying child, for a worried and anxious mind, or for a weary body that simply could not seem to settle itself after a long and difficult and wearying day of labor. The great gentleness of the chamomile was always its truest gift. Just like the peppermint before it, it was a thoroughly kind and friendly plant, rather than a fearsome or a dangerously powerful one, mild and safe enough to be a familiar and welcome evening comfort, right there in the home. A simple warm cup of fragrant chamomile tea by the dying fire, as the long day's hard work was finally and fully ended, and the darkness settled softly over the quiet homestead, was truly one of the small and tender comforts of the hard frontier life. And here, once more, I do gently remind you, this is only the history and the old tradition of the plant that I share, and it is never advice for you to act upon today. But the chamomile speaks so well to a deeper truth that we sometimes quite forget about our own ancestors. They cared not only for the aching body, but for the weary spirit and the troubled, anxious mind as well. They understood in their bones the deep and real value of rest, of calm, and of a single quiet moment of warm comfort shared at the very close of a long and demanding day. The seventh and final plant on our journey was the warm and faithful sentinel of the home. Number 7, sage. Sage is a soft, silvery green herb with a warm, earthy, woody, and altogether distinctive aroma, and it was truly one of the great cornerstones of the entire settler garden, valued just exactly as highly within the tradition of family home care as it ever was within the cooking of the kitchen. Its very name, interestingly, shares an old root with words for wisdom and for health, which tells you something real about the high regard in which people once held it. In the old tradition, the sage was carefully dried and then steeped into warm teas, and it was associated especially and particularly with the mouth and with the throat. Settler families turned faithfully to their sage tea, most particularly when the sore, scratchy, painful throats of the cold weather finally arrived, very often using it warm as a soothing gargle, held to in the long-established old folk belief that it gently soothed and comforted the irritated throat. It was a deeply familiar and trusted answer to one of the very most common small miseries of the whole long winter season. And the sage held yet another fine quality that the settlers prized very highly. Much like the garlic, and a small handful of others, it carried an old and remarkably widespread reputation as a strengthening and a steadying sort of plant, a herb that was associated with long life and with good health in the deep folk imagination of a great many different peoples across the world. A good sage plant growing right by the door was at once both a constant, ready supply for the kitchen pot and a trusted old companion in the family's own traditions of patiently caring for one another. And now, for the very last time in all our journey together today, I do remind you that this is only the old tradition and the history of how the settlers themselves once understood their sage, and that it is never medical advice or any kind of recommendation at all for you. But the sage makes such a fitting plant upon which to close because it sat so very perfectly at the true beating heart of the settler home, equally and entirely at home in the simmering cooking pot and in the family's gentle, daily, traditional care of one another. Food, flavor, and quiet folk comfort, all bound up together in one silvery, fragrant, faithful plant standing by the door. And so there you have it, all 7 of them together. 7 plants that the settlers grew, gathered, and turned to faithfully, in their own time and within their own old traditions, instead of going to a doctor who was so very rarely within their reach. The elderberry, that treasured medicine chest of the humble country people. The peppermint, the gentle everyday comfort of the uneasy stomach. The calendula, the bright golden salve for the hard-worked and weathered skin. The mullein, the soft silver plant of the chest and the breath. The garlic, the trusted old strengthener of the cold winter months. The chamomile, the kindly and beloved herb of rest and of calm. And the sage, the warm and faithful sentinel of the sore winter throat. Every single one of them is a precious piece of knowledge that very nearly vanished from the face of the world entirely. The settlers, you must always remember, had no pharmacy and no hospital anywhere within their reach. What they had instead was the generous land beneath their feet, the hard-won wisdom of all those who had come before them, and a deep, daily, practical respect for the plants that they lived their whole lives alongside. And they are not in any way asking us to abandon our modern medicine, which is itself a truly wondrous gift that they themselves could only ever have dreamed of having. They are simply, quietly reminding us that the land around us was never quite as empty, or as silent, or as useless as we have somehow come to believe. And these 7 plants are truly only the very beginning of the whole rich settler tradition of home care. As I dug deeper and deeper into all of this for you, I uncovered far, far more than I could ever hope to fit inside of one single video. The old plants, the old traditions, and the deep and fascinating history that lies behind every one of them, all of it gathered carefully together into one single guide, written purely and entirely as history, which I have called The Forgotten Medicinal Garden of Early America. It is, I want to be clear, a history book, and most certainly not a medical one. And if you would like a copy of your very own to keep and to treasure, the link is waiting right there for you down in the description below this video. And if you have come to believe, as I so deeply do myself, that this old and honest knowledge is genuinely worth remembering and worth keeping, alive in the world, worth treasuring, and worth carefully passing onward, in just exactly the same way that the settlers themselves once so faithfully passed it on, then please do go ahead and subscribe to the channel. That truly is all that it takes to make quite certain that you see the very next one. And let me leave you, finally, with one last honest and heartfelt reminder, because it truly matters far more than anything else that I have said to you here today. Everything in this entire video has been only history and old tradition, the gentle story of how our own ancestors once understood these plants in their own distant time. It is not medical advice in any way, and absolutely none of it is a suggestion for you to ever treat yourself. For anything at all having to do with your own health, please always go and see a properly qualified doctor. We are only here together to remember and to honor the old knowledge, and never, ever to replace the real and wonderful care that is available to all of us today. And so next time, we shall return once more to the garden that the settlers grew so carefully on purpose, and to the genuinely surprising plants that the pioneers raised up all around their homes for beauty, for food, and for protection, all at the very same time. That whole story is playing right here on your screen right now. Thank you, from the very bottom of my heart, for spending this precious time here with me today, and I will be seeing you again very soon in the next one.